Loud. Hi, thanks everyone for joining us. I'm Dr. Denise D'Amico, Professor of History, and I'm here with an alum, Jalen Wells. Jalen Wells was class of 2018. At St. Francis, he majored in history and secondary ed, social studies secondary ed. He also played cornerback for the Red Flash football team, and he won the inaugural Art and Carmela Martinuska Endowment Scholarship in 2017. He now lives in Great Mills, Maryland, where he teaches social studies and coaches football and track for Great Mills High School. So I'm gonna start by asking Jalen a question, and then I'm gonna let him present to you on the topic today, the relationship between Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. So Jalen, I thought I would just start by asking you why you chose this topic when I asked if you wanted to give a little talk related to Martin Luther King Day today.
That's a great question. Thank you for the introduction. I chose this topic because we often think about Martin Luther King and Malcolm X in a relation. We think about them when we discuss the civil rights movement. They're obviously the two major figures, but we never really talk about the relationship between the two, not just between the different viewpoints of how the civil rights movement should work, but also the personal relationship that these two men had.
Thanks, Jalen. So go ahead with your presentation.
All right, so as Dr. D'Amico said, this presentation is going to be about the relationship between Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. Okay, so to start, I wanted to give a little bit background on both men. Martin Luther King Jr. was born January 15th of 1929 in Atlanta, Georgia. He was born to two educated parents. His father was a reverend as well. That's pretty well known there. He attended Morehouse College, which is a traditional, historically Black university. And he also received a PhD from Boston University. And he actually, this is an interesting backstory to him. He had a white friend growing up who lived across the street. And that's going to come back later. Malcolm X was born in May 19th of 1925 in Omaha, Nebraska. Now, he grew up in foster homes. He lost his parents when he was 6 years old. Most of those foster homes were in Michigan and Massachusetts. Malcolm's father was killed in what was called a streetcar accident. Malcolm grew up not believing this, and it sort of festered inside of him believing that his father was killed by white people. Now, the whole reason Malcolm left Nebraska was because the KKK ran his family out of Omaha, which typically in a traditional sense, we don't think about the KKK being in anywhere but the South, but obviously quite a strong population in Nebraska. But it's also more or less assumed and accepted that the KKK also killed Malcolm's father. So the main differences between the two that we're going to discuss was the attitudes towards America. So King gave the I Have a Dream speech, as we've all heard, which is a very positive, very hopeful speech, as opposed to Malcolm X, who gave his God's Judgment of White America speech, which is much more negative and no hope almost at all. Just to give a little bit of an example here, this is not the first disagreement, especially among African-American leaders. We can look back at W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, who both lived and were prominent leaders during the late 18th and early 19th, let's just say late 19th and early 20th centuries. Both men were very well educated. Both were leaders in the NAACP as well. Booker T. Washington believed more that the only way to equality would be with drastic measures. He aligned more with Malcolm X. He was more militant and believed that there should be more, as it says, drastic, militant, aggressive measures to achieve equality. On the flip side, Du Bois believed that this would only serve to perpetrate white oppression of African Americans. He believed that the way for advancement was more so within society. He aligned more with Martin Luther King Jr. He believed that this aggressive behavior would backfire and we would just get pushed back down, as opposed to if we may build our own schools and become lawyers and doctors and successful within society, that was the way for progress. The I Have a Dream speech, just an excerpt here. Uh, Dr. King spoke 5 scores ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we now stand, signed the Emancipation Proclamation, but not 100 years later, the Negro is still not free. He said, I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. That speech was given in Washington, D.C. on August 28th of 1963 at the Lincoln Memorial. Malcolm X gave the God's Judgment of White America speech. An excerpt from his speech was, how can America atone for her crimes? The Honorable Elijah Muhammad teaches us that desegregated theater or lunch counter won't solve our problems. Better jobs won't even solve our problems. An integrated cup of coffee isn't sufficient pay for 400 years of slave labor, and a better job in the white man's factory or position in his business, at best, is a temporary solution. The only lasting or permanent solution is complete separation on some land that we call our own. If we are a part of America, then part of what she is worth belongs to us. We will take our share and depart. Then this white country can have peace. This was on December 4th of 1963. So we see the differing beliefs here, that Malcolm X just simply believed that African Americans and white Americans cannot live together. That is a belief that goes almost all the way back to Marcus Garvey, the Back to Africa movement. Whereas Martin Luther King believes we can live together. He has this dream that whites and blacks and other races, of course, can live together in harmony. These two men met in person only one recorded time. This was March 26, 1964. This was a short meeting. The men quickly shared pleasantries and then simply went their separate ways. King later admitted that while he respected Malcolm, he was completely in disagreement with the way that he wanted to go about civil rights. Malcolm, on the other hand, called King the 20th century Uncle Tom. So clearly these two men did not get along, okay? Especially, they only really got along in a personal setting or a professional setting. According to Louis DeCaro Jr.'s book, Malcolm and the Cross, Malcolm X sent a letter to King inviting him to a rally in Harlem and asked for a meeting with King to discuss the topic of race in America. King not only declined, but he did not even send a representative. Malcolm X took this very personally. This was really the symbolic gesture that King was almost giving Malcolm the middle finger. I do not agree with you. I think everything you're doing is wrong. I'm not even going to send a representative to go. However, Malcolm X did attend King's speech on Washington, and he actually referred to it as the farce on Washington. He was not supportive at all. So this interesting thing about this is, how could two men so focused on a similar goal have such hostility towards each other? This is more or less the point. These men did not like each other at all. Just because you're on the same side does not mean you will or have to agree. Conversely, just because you disagree does not mean you have to hate the other person. The respect between King and X was palpable, even though they disagreed. We can compare this to today. Think about the Black Lives Matter movement. We have many militant leaders in the movement who believe that the only way forward is through hostilities, through the raids, through the violent protests. But we also have others who want to move forward within the bounds of the law, even though the protests may still be legal, or they want to move forward through education or other goals similar to that. So the whole point is to look at this and say that this relationship on its own is not discussed often enough, but it's also a great reflective point to see that just because we disagree does not mean we have to hate. And just because you're on the same side does not mean you have to agree. However, by the end of both of their lives, these men had moved closer together ideologically, believe it or not. King had started to focus on more structural poverty and anti-war concerns. He wasn't as focused on the general concept of the civil rights, but more specific concerns. And these both disproportionately impacted African Americans at the time. Malcolm X became more accepting of all cultures on the flip side, including whites, after his Muslim pilgrimage to Mecca. during this pilgrimage, Malcolm X actually left the Nation of Islam, which viewed white people as the devil. So not only did he move from an ideological standpoint, but he left the religion as a whole because he became more accepting and he reflected upon himself and thought, you know what, maybe this militant view isn't quite the right view that I should be taking. I've cited my sources here.
Okay, thanks. Jalen, thank you so much for that great presentation. I think a lot of people are going to learn some important information from it. And I have one question that I would like to sort of conclude with, which is this: what sort of takeaways do you think there might be for our St. Francis students today as they reflect on Martin Luther King Jr. and his relationship with Malcolm X?
I think the biggest takeaway is that we can grow together even though we disagree. As we saw towards the end of their lives, Dr. King and Malcolm X did become more similar ideologically. So just because we start at the beginning being vehement opponents or disagreeing quite strongly, the longer we have an open mind and the more we learn, the more we can start to come together as a school, as a community, as a country, or whatever it may be. And even though we may not still agree, we can at least have respect for each other and an understanding for what each other are going through.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jalen. Much appreciated.
Anytime.
Take care.
You too.